A warm welcome. At HydePark tonight, we will feature one of Sri Lanka's greatest fans, somebody who has tirelessly worked to clear Sri Lanka's name in the international fora. Let me warmly welcome to our studios the visiting President of the All-Party UK Sri Lanka Group, former Deputy Speaker of Parliament of the United Kingdom, Right Honourable the Lord Naseby of the House of Lords of the UK Parliament.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
It's indeed a great pleasure for all of us here in Sri Lanka. Your presence indeed is an honour, Lord Naseby.
That's very kind of you to say that.
I think I'd like to start talking to you a little about your interest in Sri Lanka. I know you've done so much of work to clear Sri Lanka's name in the international fora. With all the kind of criticism that has been levelled concerning the 30-year-long war that was fought here in Sri Lanka, specifically the final stages. But first, let's talk about your visit this time to Sri Lanka.
Yes, well, this time was not anything really to do with the war period or indeed the present government. I received this invitation from your organisation called the OPA, which basically is a coming together of all the professions. 51 professions, which amazed me as a number, and even more importantly, 50,000 members. And they have an annual conference, and they asked me to be the guest of honour and lead speaker. And I found it very difficult to refuse. I haven't had one of these before. So I did some preparation. It was about sustainable development and, of course, climate change and that whole area of sustainable development is something every nation has to look at. It's not party political as an issue. There is a recognition that the world faces great problems. I mean, it's even raining here in Colombo, somewhat out of season. I mean, I thought the monsoon finished before now. And England, 1 week we have sunshine, next week it's pouring with rain. So it is a world problem, and quite rightly, the OPA are focused on that. And I think they've had a very good conference. I certainly have learnt something from some of the contributors, and I look forward to seeing the report on the conference.
I did listen to your speech made at the OPA conference where you linked professionalism to Sri Lanka's progress way forward. But let me first touch on the 2 years of hard work that you did trying to clear Sri Lanka's name. This is something we need to talk about. Last year when we spoke at HydePark back in England, you did speak about the kind of stark difference of the civilian casualties that you proved from the UN report to what really took place in Sri Lanka. Let's talk about why you really went into such depth into research.
Well, I think it was partly because I was president of the group, having started the group back in 1975. And I did that because I'd worked out here in the early 60s for the Reckitt Coleman Overseas Group, toured the whole, I was the marketing manager, toured the whole of the island, met many people who have never done politics, never been interested in politics, and I got to know the commercial side. But I did meet one man who eventually became the Speaker of your Parliament, a man called Ada Derana. He played good tennis, I played good tennis, I'm a member at Wimbledon. Unfortunately I have 2 metal knees now, so I don't play tennis. He inspired me. I had no interest in politics then. He inspired me, and ironically I become Deputy Speaker, he becomes Speaker. So when I went back to the UK, having finished my tour, I thought, see, what about politics? And then my dear wife, who was a doctor, held a small party for me when I got back, just after her. And the main guest was someone who was standing for election for the equivalent of Colombo. He was standing for the Greater London Council. And he said, well, what are you going to do while you're having your leave? Nothing, I said, other than look after the small boy. So he said, well, come and help. So that was all the beginning of it, really. So it's all Sri Lanka's fault, almost, of what I got into politics. And now you ask, why did I get involved? Well, of course, I started the group in 1975 because there was an India group, Singapore group, no Sri Lanka group. I thought it important that there be a Sri Lanka group. I wanted to help the country. It was a developing country then. And I'd followed it and paid visits, tried to help on trade deals and other things. And the war was a great tragedy, no doubt about that. And I came in January 2009. I met obviously the British High Commissioner. I also met the Defence Attaché. And he said to me, the Sri Lankan army is transformed. It's no longer a semi-professional operation. It is a very professional operation. It's a very disciplined operation. And I'm amazed, says he, how good it is. And it was obvious then the war was coming to a climax. And he said to me, I'm going to go in the field with a staff officer, and I've been told I can go wherever I want, so I shall. Now, perhaps I was a little slow in not realizing that he would send reports back. I didn't even think about it until later on. I had these wild allegations, particularly from the Channel 4 films,
right.
Claiming incredible numbers of people killed. The UN report, which we've never seen the evidence for, we're not allowed to see it for 20 years, we're told. That in itself is extraordinary. Prepared by 3 people who never came to Sri Lanka, claiming at least 40,000 civilians killed. Then other people were talking about 70,000. Some reporters, one
just
at the BBC.
Yesterday, Jasmine Sukha says 75,000 civilians were killed during the conflict here in Sri Lanka. Now, Jasmine, a part of the tri-member committee of the Darusman report.
It's quite extraordinary,
latest.
Quite wrong. Here, and this was only yesterday or the day before, this is a senior UN official peddling absolute lies. And I find that extraordinary. She knows the work I have done and other parties have done, or she must know. And we've been through the dispatches. You've had your very impartial census. You've had evidence from India, all of which comes down to a conclusion of maybe 5,000, maybe 6,000, no more. And indeed, there are signed statements from one of the major doctors, senior doctors, that he thinks it's only 2,500. And the Amnesty filming from the space shows where they can see from there the indentations of where people have been buried. That only shows about 2,500. So we don't know the exact number. That's why the Missing Persons Commission is so important.
How did you really get into proving that it was the civilian casualties, maybe around 2,000 to 3,000? Yes, that's unfortunate, but compared to some 40,000 as claimed wrongly by certain organizations, the UN specifically. How did you go into, I mean, I know we've spoken about this 2 long years, but how?
Well, we have a Freedom of Information Act in the UK. And a friend of mine who is a barrister in the House of Lords said, Michael, you have to go and read that act properly. And I'd never read it properly before, so I read it very carefully. And I discovered there what exactly I had to do. So I wrote formally, both to the Ministry of Defence and to the Foreign Office. I was quite clear from the Ministry of Defence, they said it was the Foreign Office's responsibility, so okay. I heard nothing from the Foreign Office for some months. So I sent a reminder, and I get a refusal to supply any information because it's classified. So I appeal, and there's a mechanism to appeal. So it's reviewed again. Then that's rejected. Then there's a higher authority within the Foreign Office. Again, a big delay. So I appeal again. And each time I add why I think this is so important, that this is established, because the end of the line, we were talking about war crimes and the implications of that. Well, with the Foreign Office, it took well over a year to get nowhere. But then I had read the Act, and in there it says there is another source of appeal, which is the Information Commissioner. So I then read up who is the Information Commissioner, talked to them. They said you must put a formal submission in depth, which I did, on why I thought it was vital, principally because there are 500,000 diaspora in the UK, let alone everybody here. Mm-hmm. And they said, yes, you have a good cause. So I then got some dispatches, very heavily redacted. An interesting bit of that was that there were quite a lot in January, quite a lot in February, and then it began to tail off. And there was none in May, one in April, and I thought to myself, something wrong here. Mm-hmm. Did Colonel Gash go on holiday or something like that? And of course
Colonel Gash was the defence attaché.
He was the British military attaché.
Here in Colombo.
Now, he's an experienced colonel in our armed forces. He wouldn't have that job if he was not a balanced, experienced senior officer. So I look at the dates and I said to the man, the information, this is strange. He agreed. I'll find out. And then lo and behold, some weeks later, we get an apology from the Foreign Office that these were on a different computer. Well, that might be so. Why didn't somebody know about that earlier? Mm-hmm. Or I don't know. But anyway, I get some more. And in those, it's quite clear, there's a bit of one of Colonel Gash's two key things. One, he estimates 5,000 to 6,000 civilians. Mm-hmm. And secondly, he states that he paid a surprise visit to Trincomalee, where some of the IDPs who were wounded were taken. And he says it's amazing, the care and trouble that the Sri Lankan armed forces are taking to look after these shocked people, disadvantaged people, injured people. And that indicates that there never ever was any policy to kill civilians.
Colonel Gash, as you say, also, as we know, a senior military officer, somebody who's honoured in the United Kingdom, who was posted in Sri Lanka for his responsibility. But was there a deliberate attempt here to hide the figures?
Well, there's two elements to it. I can't say whether it was deliberate or not. It would be unusual for anybody to have asked a Freedom of Information inquiry. I mean, I think that's what surprised the Foreign Office. And now, there are probably some statements in there that are confidential in the sense that other countries that are friendly nations to the UK mm-hmm. will, as part of their contract, really say to the UK, this is confidential, and they would be really alarmed if confidential information was published. Now, the final element of this was that even after I got the dispatches, mm-hmm. there were these black lines everywhere. And I then looked again at the Act and talked to the Information Commissioner. He said, well, you can appeal to a tribunal. So I thought, I've come this far, I might as well appeal to a tribunal. So I had the tribunal, 3 judges. They said to me in the summing up, Lord Naseby, we admire what you've done so far. We realise why you've done it. We understand that it's important to you and to the people of Sri Lanka what you have done. And having done that, we still have to say to you, we're sorry, but we can't demand that the redactions are removed, because we have listened to the Foreign Office, who say that if they remove the redactions, then that will undermine their relationship with other friendly nations. I understand that, but I don't understand the depth of redaction that there is in the dispatches that I've got.
Lord Naseby, we were trying to understand the allegations made against Sri Lanka in terms of civilian casualties during a war that was fought against a terror group in the country. But I'd like to go to Resolution 30/1 in 2015 and Resolution 34/1 in 2017, which were both co-sponsored by Sri Lanka. Now, at the same time, this was following the resignation of the government of the United States from the UNHRC, calling it a cesspool of bias. I'd like to know what your view is, and also whether the UK government, the Parliament, has considered revisiting these resolutions, especially because the US was a key party to sponsoring and bringing these resolutions to moving it into the UNHRC?
Well, as you know, the US has actually withdrawn from the UNHCR at the moment. I doubt that they'll go back into it. And at the time when they withdrew, in other words, and the UK took over, I certainly made strong representations that we should withdraw and wind it all up. And I made a major submission to the UNHCR in writing with proof of purchase, proof of delivery of my papers. I never even got an acknowledgement. I mean, it's a very strange organisation. I offered to go, not as a representative of Sri Lanka, but as an individual politician and pay my own way. I was quite happy to do that and give evidence. And it is an extraordinarily closed operation. There is, nevertheless, within the Foreign Office, a view that because it's a former colony, if you like, and there are strong feelings of 500,000 Sri Lankans in the UK, that Britain should continue to take an interest in reconciliation, etc. And I understand that. But it is taking an interest in helping as opposed to interfering. And there's just a recent example last week that comments on good progress. That's good. And hopefully further help. But then it throws in this criticism that they didn't like the appointment of the Chief of the Armed Service. Well, that's rubbish. Not our concern who is Chief of the Armed Forces. That's entirely in the purview of Sri Lanka. Any more than we would expect you to object to, I was an RAF pilot, to object to the senior man in the RAF. So, I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. And I shall be taking it up as soon as I get back. Why do we do this? It's not part of reconciliation to do that. It's undermining reconciliation. I do have one worry here, though, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but it is missing persons. It is the key that will unlock the door if we can prove, at least partially prove, and it will take time, I accept that.
Are you saying that the Office of Missing Persons has to get back on track and to be working on this?
I am, and I've been to see the head of the missing persons here on this trip, although it's not a political trip, this one. And he says to me, we don't have the resources. And I find it shocking, quite frankly, that there are inadequate resources in that department.
What resources?
Financial resources to provide for investigators to track down the individuals. They've got lists of individuals given by the families, track down where they've actually gone. Were they killed, or have they gone somewhere else in the world? And certainly we have in the UK some illegal immigrants that have come into the UK. I'm sure there's some in Canada, and I'm sure there's some in the USA, and probably some in Australia who are allegedly missing, but they're actually well and kicking somewhere else. Now, obviously, the work the missing persons are doing is very thorough, but they need more resources to do it.
Can we not get all these foreign funding and all organizations that are very much interested in Sri Lanka, NGOs, they're probably well-meaning when they take up allegations against Sri Lanka to fund?
Well, you would think so. They're supposed to be doing good, aren't they? You would think so, but too many of them get. And you've got to remember that there are still LTTE supporters out there. You have a very active diaspora in certain parts of the UK. That is a problem in the sense that we have elections and the political parties are sensitive to the Tamil vote, and they're always in marginal seats, so that's an added dimension. And we do have difficulty. I mean, I remember Mr. Cameron, I had a meeting with him with representatives from the ethnic groups. And he'd just seen one of the films produced by Channel 4, and he was livid. And I said to him, well, quieten down, you know, Prime Minister. This is all unproven allegations, as we subsequently learned, and when they were looked at, the allegations made were all wrong. But of course, television has major impact. and you know, it creates the wrong atmosphere.
You did mention that you will take up the kind of criticism that was leveled internationally, especially by the US and the UK, about the appointment of Lieutenant General Shavindra Silva to the highest post of the military here in Sri Lanka as the Chief of Army. How do you intend to do this?
Well, I shall write formally to the Foreign Secretary, who do know. I don't know the extent he knows the Sri Lanka. I shall offer to meet him, and I would hope we'll get a discussion with Mr. Rab, so he can be briefed by me on what my observations are of Sri Lanka today and why it is very important that we bring UNHCR's inquiry to an end, and we have got to face up to alleged war crimes. And personally, and it's only me as a politician, I think the answer has to lie somewhere along a Peace and Reconciliation Commission.
Lord Naseby, with all the efforts that you will be putting together there in the UK, what can we in Sri Lanka do here? This is our country, our nation, and how do you, in your view, think that the whole of Sri Lanka, all Sri Lankans, all of Sri Lanka can come together to make this a concentrated, concerted effort to clear Sri Lanka's name internationally?
I do notice that you are trying hard, locally I'm talking about now, and in a strange way, although the tragedy of the Easter bombings, it was a wake-up call really, in that nobody expected it. I didn't expect it, you didn't expect it, and heavy loss of life. But I think that caused people to just think a little bit. Now, I think that any government has to work hard at all levels to make sure that there isn't a separation between Tamil, Muslim, Christian, and the majority population, Sinhalese. So you've got to work hard at that. What I'm going to try and do in London, in the UK, is at the moment the FCO, the Foreign Office, see just a group of Tamils or a group of Muslims or the Sinhalese. I'm going to suggest to the Foreign Office that they should now have a joint meetings. Say, we would like to talk to the Sri Lankans, and we expect the Tamils to turn up and the Sinhalese to turn up and the Muslims. Maybe if there's the odd particular thing that affects one community, that you can have a separate meeting. But at the moment we've been seeing them all separately, and I think that's wrong. That is not bringing reconciliation together. But you have done one good thing. You've sent us into the UK a really good High Commissioner. She's settled in, she's been taking initiatives and working in the community as well. And good luck to her. And thank you for sending somebody that sort of talent. And I hope she'll be supported by her government here to continue to do that work.
We do continue to see protests held by certain civilian groups or immigrants in the UK for a banned organisation, the LTTE, allowing such protests for an organisation against a government, a democratic government. How have you raised this up with
Well, unfortunately, we're a very open democracy. We did complain. You will recall at the last annual day celebrations, we had demonstrations outside your High Commission. With even somebody got a T-shirt on recommending Prabhakam. That should not be allowed. But thankfully, we took it up. And thankfully, we made strong representations about the World Cup. As far as I could see, there were no anti-demonstrations during the World Cup. Now that is the first time we've had a major cricket tournament where we've not had demonstrations. So maybe we're beginning to make a little progress.
Along with that, I'd like to touch a little about the Easter attacks, Easter Sunday attacks. You did mention about how shocking it was for us all in Sri Lanka. Everyone came together in shock when innocent Easter worshippers were targeted. This is a scenario that we have seen in the West with targeted civilian explosions, massacres and damages caused to public property. Faith is very important here in Sri Lanka too, with communities from different ethnic groups, but the United Kingdom is far more diverse here.
We have suffered, same as you had. I think of the Manchester bombing. They were in a pop group concert, and I can't remember the exact numbers killed, but it was, I think, in nearly 3 figures. We had the march, the people in London on the bridge, just out the blue, killed. So we do have a problem. We do put resources into intelligence, and half the secret must be adequate resources put into intelligence, so that in our case, the police and in particular have a unit that is well briefed, well financed, and they have to make the decision who has to be watched and who isn't being watched, and you have to face up to that requirement. And I'm not totally confident that that's happening in Sri Lanka. It was happening when the war was going on, but it doesn't seem to me, and I may be wrong, but it doesn't seem to me it's happening in the depth that it was before. And you have to have that, really. Otherwise, it'll happen again, because the whole world's facing up to the difficulties caused by ISIS and ISIL and some of these extraordinarily violent groups that there are around.
Lord Naseby, I'd like to talk to you about Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. What is this I'm hearing about?
This is my writings. I've written a book. It'll be launched in February the 26th in the UK. I've talked to a publisher here. I can't disclose the name of it, but I'm very confident that it will be printed here with a local publisher, and somewhere around that period of the end of February we'll arrange a launch here as well. And it is the reflections from the day I arrived in April '63 right up almost to, I mean, I do mention right at the end the Easter bombings, and I really end up, I mean, all the way through, and it covers the periods where I've made particular help, like the tsunami, where my wife and I came to help through some of the more difficult periods, and some of the joys of travelling around, the friendships one's made. And there's 19 chapters. And I end up by saying that 2 things really, that this country itself has to show leadership, because leadership is what creates growth and a stable economy and a society that people are comfortable in. And it needs also a plea to the outside world to show understanding of the challenges, probably the unique challenges that Sri Lanka has faced over a very long period of time.
Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. This is definitely a book all of Sri Lanka will be looking forward to come February 2020. April 1963, Lord Naseby, I'd like to go back to your recollection of then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, when you flew into the Ratmalana airport back in 1960.
Of course, I didn't know I was coming, really. I mean, I was working in India, in Calcutta, for the Reckitt and Coleman group. Calcutta is not the most exciting city in the world, and it's certainly not the cleanest city in the world. And I was called in one Monday morning and told that I had to move quickly, because the Barasab was on furlough, on leave, and the marketing manager had been doing allegedly some illegal gem dealing, and he was to be shipped home quickly, and I was to take over temporarily. So, and of course I was in northern India, very different to Sri Lanka. A beautiful day, I can still remember now, beautiful day arriving here, arriving at Ratmalana airport, with my wife, the baby, the dog, and a shotgun. I say a shotgun because I was tipped off that your customs were very, very strict in those days. But if I had a gun with me, they'd be more interested in the gun than anything else. I still remember that.
So did they take anything away?
Yeah. So there you are. And I travelled the whole country in the time I was here, and we've already discussed Ada Derana. And I came away thinking to myself, it was a wonderful part of the world, but not thinking that I would, when I got back, that I would be like to be involved 10 years later and get really involved for the rest of my life, really.
Your love for Ceylon then and now Sri Lanka, your commitment and dedication to uplift the country's image. I'm amazed by that, Lord Naseby. We're indeed honoured by your work. But I'd like to talk a little about tourism here in Sri Lanka. Took a hit after the Easter Sunday attacks when tourism was really catching on. And we did manage to have an increase of arrivals in August from a drop of 37,802 in May, following just after the Easter attacks. You love to travel here in Sri Lanka. You've been traveling a lot. How do we revive this industry now?
Well, firstly, I pay tribute to your High Commissioner in London. We talked about it on the phone. She said to me, what do you think of the idea of having an extraordinary travel conference? I said, excellent idea. I used to be in advertising. So she put on, at very short notice, a travel show. We had one before the bombing, a big one in London, and the travel trade was thrilled that somebody senior was there to tell them what was happening. And they found that very reassuring. I'm also pleased that the notices from the Commonwealth, I think it was possibly Australia was the first to say on their news advice to travellers that it was back to normal. We in the UK, I'm afraid, were not first. But I had to have a go at our people and say, well, if it's been announced in Australia and it had been announced also in the US and I think France or Germany, and I said, well, why aren't we announcing it? The next day we apparently announced it. So I think, yeah, there's a reassurance there, and your people have done a good job, and it will continue to climb now. Quite confident of that. So it is a wonderful destination.
I hope you've mentioned much of that too in your book, the book that you've authored, that we all look forward to reading. The Lord Naseby, about leadership. You spoke to us about leadership here. I did promise to talk about the presidential election. Of course, I'm not going to put you in that tight spot where you will have to comment on the presidential candidates. But Sri Lanka, a small island nation, a paradise lost, paradise regained from your book. How do we, where do we go from here? We are talking about presidential candidates, the importance of national security, the importance of hub status, developing Sri Lanka to be a key destination in the world, in the shipping route of this world. But how do we find a leader that will drive and steer Sri Lanka towards this goal?
Well, it's strange, isn't it? The UK in its hour of need discovered Mr. Churchill, who'd been a bit of a rebel when he started life as a politician. And all of a sudden, when we faced our real day of doomsday, Mr. Churchill appears, supported by Mr. Attlee. So they had a team there of a charismatic man at the top and a really good, effective, quasi-civil servant doing the implementation. And you achieved that in the war period. The final stages of it, that was really good. But one thing you do have a democratic system. People, your turnout at your elections are higher than our turnout at elections in the UK. And that's a great tick for Sri Lanka. And you're right, you are on the crossroads of the world. And you've now got Port City, Colombo. I went round it yesterday. That is an inspiring place that you've got there. We had our Canary Wharf, which is not dissimilar. And there was considerable criticism in the beginning of Canary Wharf. And I, in discussions yesterday, suggested that your people should come in and just study what happened at Canary Wharf. It's a huge success. And this will be a huge success. You are on the route that the world takes. And you're, by sheer chance, beautifully positioned And you are an efficient nation, and you're good traders. But it comes back to each level. That's why this conference that I was invited to is important. There's some good leaders there. And you've got the youth now. You've got to make sure that, yes, your universities are geared up to produce those leaders, and maybe that does need a little bit of reviewing. Certainly we had to go through it. Our universities have changed quite dramatically over the last 20 years. And I suspect your own universities need to look at the product that's being produced and are the disciplines that are being produced the ones that Sri Lanka needs looking forward for the next 20, 30 years.
In terms of our foreign policy, this is we have a lot of allegations and kind of tug of war within the country, as you may be aware, Lord Naseby, that Sri Lanka has slowly navigated away from a non-aligned policy towards the West, when the increasing importance of the West is on the decline, that Sri Lanka is trying to align itself with the West, that is also putting Sri Lanka in trouble. Now this, I'm trying to bring out the kind of worries from within the country. How can we look at our foreign policy direction? Because you have extensive experience here studying Sri Lanka's case.
Well, I would have thought you go back to the original policy you had, which was a non-aligned one. I mean, I see you've got investment here from the USA, you've got investment from the UK. We need more from the UK, and I should be putting forward a few thoughts on that. It's quite clear at this point in time, China has decided that you're a key player in terms of your geographical location. And you've got your next door neighbour, India, who I've always very carefully looked at Sri Lanka. And you have to have that sophisticated foreign service that manages to balance all these needs. But the key still remains to get rid of the UN's, UNHCR, frankly, and it's an interference. It's all very well somebody saying from the UN that, you know, you've got to achieve this, that and the other, reconciliation. Yes, of course you have. But you can do it much better on your own bat now. Everybody understands that here. And you've got the institutions there to make it happen.
When you say get rid of the UNHRC and the kind of interference in internal matters of Sri Lanka, now this is not just the UNHRC, we also have the UK and the USA, although it is not a member now, and certain other European nations also engaged in pushing resolution after resolution for Sri Lanka, and also Sri Lanka did co-sponsor. There has been an internal battle about why Sri Lanka co-sponsored this. But what needs to be done here, Lord Naseby? Office of Missing Persons, yes, we spoke about that. How can we bring our resources together, the leadership of the nation and the legislature?
I don't know the answer to that question, really. I mean, it's quite a challenge, I accept that. But the world needs to understand that Sri Lanka's been through a long period of difficulty, that it's made huge progress. Needs, yes, some aid to help. When I look back at Victoria Dam, and both parties in the UK supporting it, that was important in terms of aid. And at that point in time, it was a key investment of over 100 million. We have to get to a situation where that happens again. And that means at our end, we have to get a grip of the diaspora. The diaspora should be investing in Sri Lanka instead of complaining about Sri Lanka. And that's a challenge for our nation to try and ensure that the Sri Lankan diaspora do get together, do understand that it's their home country. They've got family here, cousins here, etc. And Sri Lanka needs them to take an interest in what is happening on the ground here and put some money and resources and efforts into it.
We look forward to your work back in the UK and for you to visit us here in Sri Lanka once more, Lord Naseby, of course, with the launch of your book. That's all the time we have here at Hyde Park, and we're indeed honoured and grateful for your presence here at our studios, talking exclusively to us at Hyde Park.
Thank you for inviting me.
We had with us Lord Naseby of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom, the former Deputy Speaker of the UK Parliament, President of the all-party UK Sri Lanka group, joining us here at Hyde Park, talking to us exclusively on Ada Derana 24.